Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 15.3 high elo top lane tier list. So for your content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, Jace got nerfed. We saw a buff towards Jax, Quinn, and Nasus, a nerf to Wukong, a nerf to Teemo, and a nerf to Cassiopeia. There are some other changes there, but they were mostly focused on their other roles, but have had an impact on their top lane performance. So the D tier then is going to consist of the same champions as the previous patch, the likes of Trundle, Nasus, even with the buffs, still underperform. Both these champions obviously are predicated on bad macro. If enemy team plays the map correctly, these champions underperform. The likes of Yorick falls into the same bracket. Obviously, we've just seen Slogdog, I believe, hit Challenger on Korea. So, Yorick can, almost any champion can be used to achieve Challenger if you are proficient enough at it, understand, like, the macro, the micro decisions you need to make, and the matchup tables. There is a lot of things which go into it, but obviously, yeah, there is definitely depth to some of these champions. Yorick, I would say, has more depth than the likes of Trundle, even though they are both pretty shallow and have a limited amount of ways of playing and what they can do. In Nasus's case, with the removal of like Emax Nasus, or just like weakening it quite heavily, it's really prohibited him from being able to kind of like thrive or be relevant within high elo. This kind of a buff helps him a bit in the early game, helps him survive in situations where he might have just been or been just outright solo killed. What Nasus really needs is like a partial revert on the E enough to really find his footing again. Right now, though, I just don't believe it's gonna be enough to push him into any sort of relevance outside of maybe like a niche counter pick scenario. Alawi, obviously another champion which traditionally struggles quite aggressively in high elo, mostly because a lot of the matchups and a lot of the ways which Alawi basically comes down to, if you can consistently land your E on a target, you can use that to like chunk them out of lane and then use that to siege. But if you can't consistently land your E, whether they're playing with range or playing in such a way which just prohibits you from really finding those angles, Alawi really devalues as a champion, and I think that really punishes her, especially in Master Plus. Mundo and Tom are pretty heavily nerfed, mostly through the item system, or in Tom Kench's case, both direct nerfs and the item system. Mundo had like a slap on the wrist last season where they took away more of his E health scaling to 80 damage. That went down a bit. In Time Kench's case, they went after his base armor, his base Q damage, his AP ratios, and that has effectively basically made him irrelevant for Master Plus brackets. This champion's also going to get tagged in 15.4 with the Heartstone nerf, and at that point I would just recommend avoiding both these picks. They are going to be outperformed by most things in the top lane, unless you give them more gold just an exponentially large amount of gold, whilst allowing them to freely get their Heartstone procs so they can scale up or be relevant within the game. Mundo can be played in more matchup scenarios, but Tahm Kench, I think it should be like one of the weakest top laners at the moment, so definitely recommend avoiding these champions. Uda is doing a bit better at the moment. I think he's more of a high C tier option. Obviously, he still underperforms quite aggressively compared to where he used to be when before they nerfed his RR and his space damage on the R. It makes his wave clear weaker, his trading weaker, but Axiom Arcanist has definitely done something. It's helped him a bit. Plus the fact that, yeah, people are picking him back up again. I think this champion has a bit more room to go, but he still underperforms compared to where he used to be. Still not a pick I'm really going to recommend. Lee Sin, obviously very niche, very gimmicky, reliant on just like outplaying your opponent and hoping for solo kills early on to the game to really allow this pick to have any sort of relevance within the game. If you fall behind or you're not getting the advantages you need, this champion will really struggle and it will just become an alt bot more than anything. Obviously, his wave clear is decent. Like the E gives him access to wave clear, especially if you're going like opting into like a Profane Hydra or Ravenous or a Stride Breaker. Even we've seen obviously some Stride Breaker, at least in mids, appear in competitive. It's still not a pick I'm going to recommend. If you're very comfortable with the champion, kind of maybe like akin to a Kayn, you can sometimes take it into the top lane and find a level of performance. Sejuani, I think could be a bit higher, like kind of akin to Udyr in the C tier. I think this champion has a pretty underestimated amount of damage. Like people haven't once. It's kind of like Zac in a way where people don't play against the champion enough to really understand just how much damage it can output. Time Kinch was like this for a while, but people are a bit more respectful of him and don't allow him to just get like the kidnap dives as consistently. But Sejuani, yeah, definitely reliant on like her base damage and her ability to just opt into things like Scorch, Arcane Comet, and then just looking for those W sweeps and hoping that you can land both W1 and W2 to just chunk someone and force them out of lane. She doesn't scale very well, but can act as just like obviously a tank CC bot, so there is value there. I do think this champion can sit as more like a high C tier option. There's definitely spots where you can play her and she can be relatively impactful within the draft. Swain, conditionally, really solid as a pick. I think Swain could also possibly contest with like the low B tier options. This champion obviously benefited from his buffs this patch. It makes him better in the spots he was already good in. You're still not going to pick him into spots where you're like blinding Swain. Like he is still going to be like this flex pick option, which you can sometimes opt into top lane if you are playing into like a Skarner, maybe Cassandra topside, or just a tank which can't really punish you or move you out of the laning phase. You can also like freely stack ease on. Some just underperforming at the moment. Could probably do with being a bit better to really like function within the top lane. But I believe the Titanic build is just the way to go. Like, it gives them access to wave clear, it gives them access to damage, it gives them some level of tankiness. You do obviously value armor and MR on Sion, as he does stack a lot of HP, so getting some resist alongside that is really beneficial. But Sunfire, Hollow Radiance just aren't great items in their current state, and with the nerf to unending next patch, I think this champion is going to really struggle. You might be able to opt into things like Spirits plus unending, like later on into your build, but he's just not as performant as before. I say this before, like he just hasn't been performant for a while, and I have him towards the lower end of the C tier. But you can definitely make this champion work. Once again, I think this pick does have a lot of like early game damage compared to what a lot of people expect from him. Like you can, if you're like rotating EWQ snaps onto people, it can force them out of lane, especially if they don't have access to a good amount of sustain. Mordecai is a set. Champions which are pretty vulnerable to the top lane meta and like what is popular. These picks obviously are very reliant on just walking at you and stat checking you and hoping that you misplay so they can benefit from that. I personally wouldn't recommend these champions going into Master Plus, but below Master they are great options. Like you can definitely climb all the way to Master, and to an extent through Master if you are very comfortable on them on these picks. Teemo took a slap on the wrist this patch. I don't really know what the nerf was supposed to achieve. He's still relatively similar in power in low elo. He's weaker in high elo from the nerf, as it was like a direct early game nerf towards his early lane harass. If they wanted to go after a low elo skewed thing, they probably should have gone after shrooms and their scaling, but this is the direction they went. He still remains as a C tier option. Silas, conditional C tier pick. I think in certain spots this pick can be really solid. I still wouldn't really recommend him unless you are like very comfortable in the champion. You've put a lot of time into him and you see like an angle where he can really have a lot of value. Maybe like Varus, Leona, Malphite, Gnar, stuff like that on enemy team, and he can really profit from those kind of things. So also pretty conditional counter pick. You're playing him into Gnar primarily and like ranged options. Obviously this was an old school, and relatively recent counter pick to Twisted Fate top when that existed. Obviously that only existed for like half a year, so that it's not really that relevant anymore, but he's good as range. Like that is the main takeaway. You can play him into a lot of the ranged options, and Windwall will get you a lot of value, plus the longer lane allows you to chase them down more often than not. Vayne, great into tanks which don't really have the tools to ever approach you, or champions which are very limited at just like their gap closing, like their lockdown. But that's where Vayne can really benefit as a champion. Obviously she really struggles with like team comp issues. Like when you're playing Vayne top, you need certain other things within your composition to really have value, otherwise you'll just end up in a situation where you're playing not enough engage or peel to really get enough value out of this pick. But in isolation, she's a great 1v1 marksman, and she can really comfortably function within the top lane, kind of akin to a Varus when you give her the resources. Quinn is actually going to bump up to the B tier. Champion got buffed this patch. The 20% attack speed buff on her W, which is her first max ability, obviously, was really beneficial. It allows her to CS, like trade better, CS more consistent, CS more consistently, siege better. Like it just gave her a lot more value on like that level 9 power spike where you get access to the full value of your W. Obviously, she spikes quite aggressively on 11 with second point in Valor, where she can more consistently roam around the map and just be where she needs to be. This champion, I think, is in a better spot. The electric buffs also did help her if you are opting into that tree. She's definitely, sits as more like a B-tier option now. Victor, basically fallen out of popularity in the top lane. I still think he can be fine in like situations where Grasp and like Ice will make sense. I still think you can play AP Victor top. He's just not as good as before, and the nerfs have like had a pretty big toll on him, especially in top lane where he's definitely dropped quite heavily in priority. Heimerdinger and Rengar, pretty niche picks. That's cleared. Where is Heimerdinger? Heimerdinger, Rengar, these picks can perform well in the top lane. I think they are relatively unique. You're going to play against them maybe once in like 300 games. I don't think I've played against a single Heimerdinger top this season. I've played against one Rengar. That was a pretty rough time. I just hadn't played against a Rengar for like half a year. And like if people will understand how to pilot their champion, he can output a huge amount of damage and be really oppressive within lane. But once people have played against it 1-2 times, you understand how to like play the wave, like where his weak points are, and like how to really punish him in situations where he is just making blunders or mistakes with trading. Galio's gotten off this patch. Did a bit to like hit him. I mean, you're still only really picking him as like a counter pick into like a Rumble or like AP matchups. He sits as like a C-tier option. He's just going to be very, very niche in where you like want him. I'd have him around the likes of Yasuo and Silas, where he can be fine if you pick him in the right spots. Skarner drops down for D tier. Skarner top's basically gone at this point. It was already very unpopular and not performant. The nerfs to it this patch have just dropped it down to the D tier. His ability to like turn around, kidnap someone under the tower is weaker. Like it's just not going Eastern summon for one kidnap one on the tower is just weaker. It gives them more time to react if they and you're just not going to be able to output more as much damage in between the CC duration and the ult cast. So he does struggle a bit more. The armor growth is also going to hurt him more in top lane, where he's just getting access to more XP within the game. That is it for the actually I've got one more dropping down. That is Wukong. Wukong has been got nerfed this patch. He now struggles a bit more in top lane. I think he was underappreciated in the previous patch, but now he's kind of where most people originally perceived him as being, where he's like this pretty niche okay pick into like AD sackers, where you can make more use out of your passive, and you can sometimes like stat check them or spike really aggressively on like a 1-item, 2-item kind of situation, where you're going like your Eclipse or your Trinities or your Cindered Skies. It can kind of vary, and I've seen like Profane Hydra variants. So Wukong drops down to the C tier now. The B tier then, the likes of Malphite, who I really don't like at the moment. I think he's very, very conditional, kind of akin to, like your Galio's, for example. I think even in spots where he looks best in slot, you would arguably want someone with more agency. Like Malphite is a low agency counter pick champion. And I think that in the current game state, that just isn't amazing unless you are just not confident in your ability to carry games on a carry. That is where you would take Malphite over that. So I think those are the spots where you want him. Even then, I'm not a huge fan of the champion. I could drop him down to the C tier, but I'm going to leave him in the B tier at the moment because he does have value in the right spots. It just isn't going to be as high agency as other like carry options within the top lane. Maokai definitely struggling a bit more at the moment. I'm actually going to drop Ornn down a bit. I think I overrated Ornn. I mean, I play a lot of Ornn. I really like Ornn in his current state. I think he is fine. However, just a lot of top laners are really struggling with the fact that Sunfires and Hollow Radiance just aren't great items. Like, you really just don't want to be building these options, as they feel really bad on completion. Obviously, you want the Chain Burst and you want the Barmies often, so you get access to Wave Clear. But then the full item giving you like +3, I believe, on the base damage, or +5 on the base damage, and then like a 1% bonus health ratio on it, just isn't really enough like of an incentive to want to complete them out. Like you can get more value out of like a Randuin's or a Dead Man's or a Frozen Heart if you can like get access to these items. Even, I mean, like an Abyssal is really good at the moment. I think that is where these champions are really faltering at the moment. Unending being weaker as just like a first, second option also does hurt these champions quite a bit. I think that's one of the reasons why Maokai has really suffered this season and has dropped down quite consistently. I think with the nerf going into next patch, Maokai top will basically be non-viable again, outside of like obviously spots where you can just flex him and like throw him into the top lane. It's like he's going to lose this matchup, but you're going to get some CC value out of him. He's just not a pick I'm going to recommend. Overall, I think tanks are definitely going to be struggling going into 15.4. Outside of maybe Cassante, who is probably the tank getting least scathed when he is like number one tank at the moment. So, no, I really don't understand what they're going for here. Rise sits within the B tier. I think he still works as like a solid counter pick. He's a good AP option if you are looking for someone to be flex mid to top. There are better AP options. I would still recommend a Kennen or a Aurora over him, but he can definitely have value if you pick him against like a Kennen, for example, and you can just nullify what that champion wants to achieve. Cho'Gath sits within the B tier. I actually think Cho'Gath is higher than like where I had him in the B tier. I had him towards the lower end of the B tier. I think he sits as a high B tier option. He's probably number 2 tank at the moment after Cassante, and when I would say like Cho'Gath, and I'd actually put Shen, Poppy, all in a relatively similar area in their current states. But yeah, Cho'Gath sits within the B tier, definitely performing quite well at the moment. Might get nerfed because of his performance in lower MMR and mid MMR brackets, but yeah, good pick in his current state. Does struggle into champions which can kind of play around his telegraphed abilities and have access to like true damage and yeah, just tools to kind of nullify him. Zac is fine. I think this pick's definitely weaker with some of the direct nerfs he's received to like his Q health ratio, and I believe they've nerfed his blobs a decent amount. Like his early game sustain is nowhere near as abhorrent as it used to be. Like old Zac used to be pretty unassailable in lane. Current Zac, if you deny him of blobs, is going to struggle considerably more, and I think that definitely does drop him towards the mid to low end of the B tier. Kled, pretty niche pick, but I think he can be performant if you pilot him well. He's great tower dive potential, great early game snowballing potential. If you fall behind of this champion, he will feel pretty worthless, but if you're ahead of the curve, you're opting into a heavy AD, this champion can 1v9, like, oh, I say 1v9. He can oftentimes take over top lane and jungle and like just roam on to mid, get kills, and like he can take over games. Like I think Clyde is a underappreciated champion in his current state. Kayle is within my B tier. I think Kayle is in a really good spot at the moment. I've actually tried picking up Kayle as a champion. I think the petals are pretty hidden power on this pick. Like getting access to maybe 500 to 1,000 extra XP within a game is huge. If you're able to soak up waves, plus the fact that she got buffed more recently, plus the fact that I think and she really benefits from Swifties, which are the strongest boots in the game. Kayle is a great B tier pick, which is pretty high compared to where she usually sits in a high elo tier list. Whether she'll get nerfed because of her low elo MMR, like low MMR, mid MMR performance, it'll be interesting to see. But kind of akin to Cho'Gath, I think this pick is definitely doing quite well in high elo for where she usually sits. Pantheon, I don't like Pantheon that much. I think he is, his game plan is very clear, and it often comes down to whichever top laner dies first in the Pantheon X matchup just has a miserable time. Like if you die to Pantheon, he will just steamroll lane and take over the game. If you kill Pantheon, this champion just feels pretty worthless. There are builds and like different variations of Pantheon I've seen like Synod Sky variations, Eclipse variations. I've seen like Lethality, Heartsteel variations. There's different ways of playing Pantheon, definitely, and the health ratio did incentivize building health. I think Edge of Night is a very good Pantheon item in its current state. But yeah, Pantheon, I think, is a very volatile pick, and that can oftentimes be his undoing. Plus, he's a non-combat ultimate, and that can allow a lot of champions to just beat him at 6, and that can feel quite bad on this champion. Tryndamere is, How would I describe Tryndamere? He's in a very unhealthy spot where you just hope that the enemy macro is bad and you're just left alone on side for enough time that you can just split and end the game, or you just get enough resources that no one can really match up to you. Like Ravenous plus Grasp or Ravenous plus Fleet, and with like Second Wind, D-Shield. He's just unassailable in his current state. There are champions like Poppy, for example, who can just nullify him and then just match him on sides for an entire game. But then you're just hoping on the 4v4, and that, yeah, obviously is a very coin flip way of playing the game. Overall, Pantheon says, Tryndamere sits within my B tier. I think his playstyle's pretty unhealthy and not that reliable. You're kind of just hoping that the enemy makes a mistake so you can get a big advantage within the game. Akali, I think, has very good specific matchups on the top lane. The likes of Olaf and Gwen, for example, really suffer into Akali. There are other ones, obviously, but this pick's underrated. I think more people could definitely pick up Akali in the top lane if they are comfortable for an AP Assassin. Obviously, AP Assassin in the top lane, pretty bad for composition traditionally, so it's not necessary. It's just good in specific matchups, so that's where you'd want to look for it. Warwick, still the early game menace. Like, if you can get advantages on Warwick, this champion can feel very hard to play against. If you don't like this champion snowball, kind of against Pantheon, he will just not really achieve that much within the game. He doesn't have the siege potential of like a Tryndamere. Like, his siege is relatively slow. He doesn't get the health bonus, like attack speed on towers, so he is pretty limited in that factor. But he's definitely benefited from some of the quality of life changes he's received recently. He feels a bit smoother to play. He's still very early game skewed though, and you still want to get those early game advantages. Gangplank, one of the hardest top laners to play within the game. If you can pilot this champion well, he is incredible. Okay, he's good at the moment. I think he was a bit better last season. At the moment, though, I'd say he's good if you can pilot him well. Obviously, if you can't pilot him well, he will look pretty mediocre. And in that case, I would recommend just looking towards other picks. But like, watch Solarbacker. I'm pretty sure he's running Arcane Comet on Gangplank at the moment. And yeah, you should be, if you feel comfortable on him, should be able to gain the LP and the consistency to like pilot this champion well. Singed, niche pick, still performs relatively well though. Like, I think Singed, if you pick him in the right spot, Singed mains will pick him anytime, like, and just go proxy if they're in a bad matchup. I think this champion's just unique, and that can give him the advantage in a lot of situations where people just don't understand how to play against him that well. Volibear sits as B tier pick. Also, pretty linear playstyle, but his early game strength does give him more potential in high elo, where games obviously close out faster, and having access to a lot of base damage combined with the dive potential, I think Volibear can sit quite comfortably as a B tier option. Shen, the Deadman's or the Titanic Hydra plus, so Deadman's plus Hollow Radiance or Titanic plus like Deadman's variation is decent. Like, I think they make Shen pretty similar to where he was previous split, where you are running like a Heartsteel unending setup. It's just not as good anymore. Like, you are looking towards new and different builds to kind of make this champion function. Having access to wave clear on Shen obviously removes one of his biggest weaknesses, but it does traditionally mean that you are sacrificing either durability, health, so you can't really print as, like, you're not printing as big shields, and your ultimate's just going to be a bit smaller. Overall though, I still think this champ sits as a beta pick. He has a great ultimate, which can oftentimes really help in situations of lane swaps and just counter dives. This champion, yeah, has strengths, and I think it deserves a spot within the B tier. Poppy's a bit more conditional, but I think in the right spots, Poppy is a great nullifier. She is a champion which has a lot of base damage. If you're opting into things like D-Blade, Scorch, and like you're able to just rotate Grasp passives with like Q-Procs, this champion will push a lot of picks out of lane. She just has that good base damage. The biggest concerns with Poppy though is if you're not picking it into a composition where she has value, her W will obviously be a weaker ability. She is reliant on bursting people down, and without gold, you're just losing that burst potential, and that will make her struggle a bit more within the game. So she sits as like a mid B tier pick, but in the right spots, she definitely climbs quite aggressively. In the wrong spots though, she is just less valuable than other picks within the game. Vladimir, doing decently fine at the moment, a solid B tier pick. Definitely going to be like here as like an option that people opt into if they are comfortable and want an AP source within their team comp. Urgot, great pick, the best pick in the game for low air and mid MMR at the moment. Surprised he didn't get nerfed in 15.3, will probably get nerfed in 15.4. Higher up though, the matchup table is just not good enough for him. Like, I think he could be an A tier pick, but when you're picking him into like Cassante, Ambessa, Jace, Narb, Aurora, these champions just all counter him. Kennen, like Jax is relatively neutral skill, but Gragas, Rumble, Fiora, Yone, they're just a lot of bad matchups which are common in high elo. In low elo, he wins most of his matchup tables, and the harder to pilot picks will just lose by default because the person piloting them just won't play them well enough to get the win in the game. Overall though, yeah, Urgot sits as a high B2 option. If you pick him in the right spots, he is still one of the most valuable AD champions you can have in top lane, especially if you get him to like level 9, level 13 with like a 2-item spike. This champion is incredibly powerful in those spots. Garen could probably jump to the A tier as well. I think I'm going to have Urgot and Garen at the high end of the B tier with like your Aatroxes. I think these picks are all very good at the moment. They just end up being a bit conditional and struggle a bit more into like the A and the S tier options in their current state, which is why I kind of prohibited from jumping to the A tier. But Aatrox's Shojin will take Psycho Sword build into tanks or into squishies. You want Voltaic into tanks. You traditionally go things like Cleaver as well. But yeah, doing really well at the moment. If you pick him in the right spots, he can become really unkillable and output a huge amount of damage. Garen with Axiom Arcanist has found his footing again, plus the fact that TP is a weaker summoner spell. Champions which didn't run it as standard, like Garen with Ignite, really benefited from it. Garen also goes Swifties now, which was a thing he didn't do in the previous season. He was going like Zerkers still. So a lot of things have just benefited Garen. I don't think he deserves a spot within the B tier at the moment. Olaf, great as a conditional pick, can oftentimes just run over matchups and champions which don't have the tools to like fight him, especially when he's in ultimate. Like Urgot, for example, is a great example where Olaf nullifies 3 of his abilities and can just run the matchup throughout the entire game. He's definitely got good value into specific spots. His obviously biggest weakness is he's just not that blind. Like, you just can't blind him. If you're picking him into range, he will oftentimes struggle a bit more and is reliant on just getting chain, like having ally jungler chain gank him to get those advantages, so he can obviously target out the carries and just run at them and hopefully stat check them before he ends up being taken down. Gwen, great in specific spots as well. I think this champion is weaker than obviously she was previously before the passive nerf, but is still valuable in the right spots. Obviously harder to pilot than what a lot of people appreciate her as being. Traditionally into tanks though, that is where she really shines as an option. But if you're spacing effectively with like your W and you're utilizing the damage output of this champion on 3 items, she is one of the strongest champions within the game. And with Camille, wraps up my beta. Actually, I've missed a couple of champions here. Camille is gonna be one of my picks within the beta. This champion obviously has great 2v1 where you can just isolate a target out with ultimate and then hope that your ally jungler or support follows up on them, and that can be a really like consistent way of playing the game. Her laning phase is a lot weaker though. They did go after that with the last set of nerfs to Camille, and that has taken her down from like an S/A tier option to more like a B tier option. But in the right spots and with the right pairing, she is still a very effective pick within the game. The other champions within my B tier, well, actually I have one more, I have 2 more within my B tier actually. That is Varus and that is Karma. I am going to have Anivia with my C tier, but I'll talk about Anivia in a second. So Karma, I still think is really good. Her wave clear combined with her her damage with like a Malignance Cosmic Core, very high. Yeah, a great abuser of Axiom Arcanist. Will struggle into certain lanes where she can't really exploit them as easily, but her tools, her healing, her shielding, her self-peel, just gives her a lot of value at the moment, and I think she's very deserving of a B tier spot. Also a great 3-way flex pick option. In Varus's case, he is great into tanks and champions which can just never really approach him. And like he can like utilize his slow, his ultimate to just peel for himself and just output a huge amount of percentage, magic, physical damage onto a target, and oftentimes just blow them up before they can really do anything. Ginsu Hullbreaker looks to be a really strong 2-item core on him. Definitely recommend trying it out. And in Nivea's case, she has seen play because of Zeus primarily. I believe Zeus and another, I think it was Nongshim's top laner, played it today. Anivia top seems to have made some level of resurgence. Overall, I still think it's I mean, I think it's decent. I think into specific matchups, they just can never really approach her, and that can make her very effective. But she's like a one-trick champion. If enemy Anivia top one tricks a pick and really understands how to space effectively, how to utilize the champ to its max potential with like minion manipulation, it can feel really oppressive to play against. If they don't, this champion will just end up being outvalued by other options. So pick it if you're comfortable, don't if you're not. She sits as like a C tier option though at the moment. Moving on to the A tier then, the likes of Yone remain here. Yone, Fiora, I think are great options into a lot of the tanks and a lot of the juggernauts, which don't really have the burst damage to take them down, and they can just respond and output more damage, or they have tools to just nullify what they want to do, and they can either outsplit or just out-trade / chase them down. Darius doing a lot better at the moment as well, kind of akin to Garen, benefited from TP being a weak in a summer as well, as he ran Flash Ghost most of the time. He has very oppressive early laning phase. He has a fine late game. Like, if you can get a reset later on into the game, he can still output a huge amount of damage. He's just not going to be your primary factor within the late game. You do want to close out games earlier with this champion, and that does happen more consistently in high elo. So Darius definitely doing a lot better here at the moment. Sits as like an A tier option. Cassiopeia's nerfs ended up being pretty minimal. She still sits as an A tier option. She can still kite out a lot of the top lane pool. She's just not going to do as much damage as before, and that can give some windows for certain champions to either run away from her or trade back into her and win the extended fight. Rumble, obviously a very oppressive champion, especially in competitive. I believe he is number 4 after Ambessa. This pick does a huge amount of damage, plus the way he manipulates the wave is very unfair for like certain champions to deal with. Like, he can stand in front of the wave, press E, press Q, not draw minion aggro, and just chunk the enemy laner out. It's a very, very oppressive part of the champion. Gragas sits within the A tier, great nullifier, great AP damage source, can opt into like an AP bruiser build, can opt into like a more tanky build, or just a outright burst build. He has different options in what he can do, and overall he just has a good time surviving in lane and then utilizing his displacement to find angles later on into fights. Riven, if you want trick the champion, she is still an incredible pick. Obviously, if you don't want to trick the champion, she has a pretty aggressive skill ceiling. You do need the games in on this champion, otherwise she would just be outvalued by other options. Not a pick which I'm going to ever really recommend, unless you have time on her. But she is one of the biggest benefactors of like bonus AD. Like, if you can get as much AD as possible on Riven, she can output huge, like she just prints damage. Jax got buffed this patch. He sits up behind the V8 tier. I don't think he's quite S tier. They were nice buffs. It solidifies him as rather than like a low to mid A tier option, as a high A tier option. He has a great, he has a lot of great matchups which he can really comfortably nullify with Counter Strike. He just has a bit more mana to work with, which is good. Jax did have mana problems. He has a bit more HP to work with, which is also quite nice if you're opting into defensive options. Like, that amps up the value of Zhonya when you have a larger health pool. And like extended trading patterns. Also, they buffed up his R base damage, which is quite nice. Gives him a bit more burst, but more than anything, it amps up his extended trading patterns. So opting into durability can definitely be a bit better on Jax at the moment. Definitely watch for like the Iceborne Fimbulwinter build that was seeing some level of competitive. I do think the standard build though does outperform it and is what I'd recommend over it in its current state. Kennen and Renekton wrap up my A tier. Kennen is probably number 2 AP option in the top lane. Actually, number 2/3 AP option in the top lane. I think Aurora's number 1, and I'd have Kennen, Rumble as like your 2 go-to AP options after. Rumble's like your AP bruiser team fighter. Kennen more is like your AP ranged, like backline diver with like his ultimate. He can be very effective in those ways. Kennen has incredible harass with in laning phase. Champions which can't really play against it will oftentimes finding themselves falling very aggressively far behind. He can opt into like Airy, Scorch, he can opt into like Airy, Electrocute as like 2 of his main keystones. He can even opt into Conqueror into like extended trading matchups, like your tanks and stuff, and be a pretty effective champion. I really like Liandry on Kennen if you can find the angles to go it. In Renekton's case, he is still the jack of all trades in the top lane. He he has a relatively good early laning phase. He has a very powerful ultimate which can allow him to secure first and second grubs quite consistently. He spikes pretty aggressively on 1-2 items. He will fall off past that, but once you're starting like those 2 items like a cleaver steric, you are more of a body, and like utilizing the utility of the champion, the point and click, the shred on his E to really get value on this pick. And then my S tier. So Aurora benefited from Electrocute being buffed this patch. She has now once again gone back towards it as an option. She was running Arcane Comet in the previous patch. Her damage is still very high. Certain champions just never really deal with the power, like the damage this champion can output, plus the self-peeling tools on like the E and the W. It can be very oppressive for a lot of options. Plus she scales relatively well, and her ultimate is a great team fighting ability. Relia is the dominant solo queue option here. Still very powerful even with the nerf she received in 15.2 towards her base damage later on to the game. Doesn't matter as much in high elo. In high elo you are going to close out games with the advantages you find yourself on Bork and Tollbreaker, and your siege potential is just really nice at that point. Like closing out games by level 13 means most of the nerf that was like targeted towards her doesn't really factor in within that kind of game length. Gnar is still a very powerful pick, great into matchups where he can kind of kite them out and never really needs to be like put himself in like a vulnerability spot. He obviously struggles a bit more into like Ambessa, Aurelia, these champions which can like find the angles to dive onto him, but he can opt into like steel caps and still kind of like play them out in a lot of situations. I'd say he mainly just struggles with some of the S2 options. That is why I'd have him as a bit lower of an option, but he's still a great pick. I definitely do recommend picking up Gnar. He spikes incredibly hard on like Trinity and like 2-3 items. Jace with the nerf also sits towards the lower end of the S tier now. He lost a lot of base damage, and that does hurt his tank build. I wouldn't really recommend going with the tank build anymore, but the bruiser build is fine. Like you can still opt into that, and the assassin build is better once you've hit like 18 minutes into the game, and then like 20 minutes on you are like outperforming with that kind of build. Ambessa is number 2 top laner at the moment. She obviously benefited from Jace being nerfed, as that champion was like the number 2 previously. Ambessa outputs a huge amount of damage. She is pretty safe within laning phase. The W Shield Bash Grass combo combined with like sudden impact makes it very hard to ever like trade back against her. And then once you get like your first item, second item down, she is very effective on side lanes, scales really well, and yeah, great power pick. Her ultimate is also a great isolated targeting ability, and that just gives her a lot of value. And then Cassante, still number 1 top laner within the game. I'm surprised they didn't nerf him this patch. I don't think they'll nerf him next patch either, to be honest. I mean, I hope they do. I hope they take away 0 to 20 damage off his Q. I think the biggest problem with Cassante right now is just how egregiously he spikes on Iceborne, and that can make some matchups very, very hard to like ever play against him, as he can just chain slow them, output a huge amount of damage with like Sheen passive rotations, and just be a very, very effective 1-2 item tank within the top lane, which is very dominant in laning phase and very hard to ever like fight against, as he will just start check you. And overall, those are my thoughts on the 15.3 high elo top lane tier list. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.